Thanks very much, Mike. I'm going to be talking tonight about the content of my book, Hothouse Earth, Inhabitant's Guide, which I was asked to write in 2021 after the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow, where the talk was continually about keeping the global average temperature rise below 1.5 degrees C, when it was completely obvious that we had no chance of doing that even then. Book came out in the summer of 2022, and it came out during the hottest week ever recorded in the UK. First time temperatures were above 40 degrees C. So if you're going to write a book called Hothouse Earth, try to read straight come out on that sort of week. It was fantastic publicity, and at least to make people think about it for a little while. I think that works, does it? So the whole issue with 1.5 degrees is that it's regarded as the dangerous or pervasive climate breakdown guardrail. So go beyond that at our peril, if you like. But the fact is that the global average temperature rise last year was 1.54 degrees C, according to the Earth. In the last 12 months, it's been 1.67. And although we're not yet seeing 1.5 exceeded year on year, it's likely to happen by the late 2020s or the 2030s. And the way things are going, 2 degrees C could be exceeded as soon as 2039. So the point is really that avoiding 1.5 degrees C is practically impossible. That means that not only do we have the issue of slashing emissions as fast as we can, but we have to adapt to prehistoric climate, which is now unavoidable. And this is something that governments across the world are simply not doing. Does this really work, Brazil? What issue with something or other? It does now. Excellent. It's been impossible, really, to ignore the huge explosion of extreme weather in the last few years. And some of the scenes are staggering. That's Acapulco in Mexico when it was after it was hit by Hurricane Otis. I mean, it looks like something that you see in a disaster film rather than in real life. Lahaina in Hawaii completely wiped off the face of the planet by wildfires. And we're just seeing disaster after disaster, day after day. It's become the norm. But it is the norm because things are going to get worse. So as I've said just now, the global average temperature rise is already, at least for a year, getting over 1.5 degrees. Last 12 months, 1.67. It's not just the hottest for hundreds of years or thousands. It's probably the hottest since the last interglacial, which is 125,000 years ago. On the summer days, last November and this February, the global average temperature rise above pre-industrial times was more than 2 degrees C. So you can see how quickly things are progressing. Planet's temperature in May 2024 was nearly 16 degrees C. During pre-industrial times, it was around about 14. But there's been some new research come out recently which suggests that the climate pre-industrial times might have been actually cooler than we thought by about 0.2 degrees. So that makes us even closer to permanently crossing 1.5. So it's not looking good. The picture is bleak, to say the least. But there's a lot of material on this graph. I really just want to draw your attention to the different colors and relate to different decades from the 40s all the way up to current decade. And then you can see in temperature rise at the side how year on year from June to June, this graphic shows that the temperature is on the up all the time. 2023 was an incredibly hot year, at least partly due to El Nino conditions in the Pacific. That's an anomalous warming of the East Pacific, which always pumps up the average temperature of the planet. But things haven't really dropped back very much over the last 6 months, even though the El Nino has disappeared. And it's still perfectly possible that this year will be actually hotter than last. Where are we now in geological terms? Well, this is a graphic of the last 25,000 years. You can see along the bottom, temperature up the side. You can see that we came out of Ice Age. The Ice Age effectively finished about 10 or 11,000 years ago. After that, the temperature was relatively stable. It may have dropped a little bit. Then it shot up again in the last 200 years. You may hear deniers talk about things like the medieval warm period, the Roman warm period, saying, oh, things were hotter then. Well, they weren't hotter then.
We don't know of any time when temperatures went up as quickly as they are now, or anything like as quickly. So it's an experiment, and we have no idea what the end of that experiment is going to entail. One way of looking at what global heating is doing to the planet is looking at how much energy is coming in and how much energy is going out. It's called the Earth's energy balance or heat balance. Now, this goes back from the present day all the way to 150,000 years ago, and it shows periods when the heat balance was positive during interglacial periods and negative during ice ages. And you can see that over that whole 150,000 years, it didn't really change that much. Look what it did between 1971 and 2020 and what it's done in the last 3 years. This is another example of the idea that we're in an experiment and we have no idea what the end product is going to be, except it's not going to be very nice. What are we doing? Well, there are lots of cartoons about climate breakdown, but this really says it all. It's settled. We agreed to sign a pledge to hold another meeting to consider changing course at a date yet to be determined. That is the whole COP climate conference process in a nutshell. We've had 30 years of climate conferences. They haven't made a single dent in emissions at all. The only time emissions have dropped very slightly was during the pandemic, and nothing to do with this. And increasingly, the fossil fuel corporations are making the most of the COP conferences by sending hundreds and hundreds of delegates there because they know all the global leaders are all there and they can get at them all at the same time and say, I hear you've got gas resources, please let us get them out for you. It's just utterly depressing. And we're going to see the same thing again in Baku at the end of next month. Azerbaijan, another petrostate, has been, for some god-awful reason, given the COP conference go-ahead. Azerbaijan is one of the worst countries in the world in terms of its emissions. It's actually going backwards. And if the whole world adopted the same climate plan as Azerbaijan, we would be seeing a 4 degrees C plus temperature rise. Why we are having a climate conference there, I have absolutely no idea. No, it's very easy to give up hope in terms of where we are at the moment, or where we seem to be going. And there are these limits like 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, etc. But the key point is that every ton of carbon dioxide or methane we can stop being emitted, every 0.1, every fraction of a degree C we can stop the temperature rise reaching is critical. So even if we get beyond 1.5, even if we get beyond 2, that just makes it even more important that we act to stop climate breakdown, which is inevitable, becoming a climate cataclysm. And you can see the sorts of emission falls that are needed to stay below 1.5 and 2 degrees, and even higher figures. You can see past emissions going up there. They need to plummet by 2030, something like 42% at least, for us to have any chance of staying under 1.5 degrees. And similarly, for 2 degrees, you can see a similar drop is required. There is no way on Earth that emissions are going to fall 42% in the next 65 months or so. It's not going to happen. But that doesn't mean we can't keep fighting. And another point to make in terms of this graphic is that 1.5 degrees as a dangerous climate change guardrail is purely arbitrary. I mean, again, returning to the extreme weather we see around the world, for many, many people, climate breakdown is already extremely dangerous, and many thousands are dying as a result of the explosion of extreme weather that's going on every day around the planet. There's a lot of information on here. I just want to point out a few things. It looks at pledges and promises from COP conferences and what the global temperature rise will be if we stick to them all. That's what all these things are here. But I'm not going to bother about the pledges and promises because they're never kept. This is policies and action. So on the basis of current policies, the global average temperature rise would be something like 2.7 degrees C at the end of the century. That's what's predicted. But could be as high as 3.6, which is probably a lot more realistic given feedback effects. And in fact, a recent poll of climate scientists suggested that something like 80% thought we would be exceeding 2.5 at the end of the century, and nearly half thought we would exceed 3 degrees C, and I'm one of those. Now, one reason why 1.5 degrees is so critical is that a number of key tipping points are estimated to happen at around about that temperature, maybe even lower than that. And these tipping points, once they've tipped, will stay tipped. So, if we do what politicians would like, and that is carry on almost as usual and then attempt to suck carbon out of the atmosphere afterwards at enormous cost and enormous cost of energy and money, it won't make any difference if certain elements of the climate system have tipped already. Now, at 1.5 degrees, it's estimated that the Greenland ice sheet up here, the West Antarctic ice sheet, will both begin to collapse, and that commits us ultimately to a 12-meter sea level rise. That would be irreversible. Other things that will happen at round about that temperature are the collapse of this system of currents called the subpolar Gaia here. That will result in something like 3 degrees C fall in global average temperature and affect particularly the North Atlantic. One thing you may have heard a lot about recently is what's called the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which is a big issue. If that collapses, you're looking at maybe 10 degrees cooling in the North Atlantic region, but I'll look at that in a minute. So this is why 1.5 degrees is so critical. Once we go beyond that, we almost certainly have committed ourselves to things happening that will change literally the face of our planet. So let's zero in on a couple of these tipping points. First of all, what's happening at the poles? They're heating, first of all, 4 to 5 times faster than the rest of the planet. There's something called polar amplification. Melting rate now is something like 6 times what it was in the 1980s. Between 92 and 2022, 7.5 trillion tons of ice was lost from both poles. And Greenland itself is shedding about 400 billion tons of ice a year now. Now, slightly worryingly, well, more than slightly, in Antarctica, the melting rate increased threefold over a 5-year period between 2012 and 2017. Now, if that continues to increase at that same rate, then you're looking at, by mid-century, a sea level rise of several centimeters a year. And there's no particular reason to think it would slow down. One of the other worrying points is that the East Antarctic ice sheet, which is nearly all of Antarctica, that whole bit on the right there, these are the mountains that separate East and West, but the whole of East Antarctica is now starting to melt significantly. Glaciers are on the move around the coastline in a number of places. That was thought to be much more stable until temperatures reached much higher levels. And just to remind you that an ice-free Earth would see sea level about 60 metres higher than it is at the moment. I live in the Peak District, north of Derby, and the sea would just about come into Derby, which is, at the moment is about as far as you can get from the sea in the UK. Now, obviously, if the ice is melting more rapidly, we should see that reflected in sea level rise. And we do. Here is a graphic, time across the bottom, millimetres here, and the rate of sea level rise. Most of the 20th century was only about 1.5 millimetres a year. But gradually, if you look at, as come closer and closer to our present day, between 2014 and 2019, it was 0.5 centimetre every 2 years. That's beginning to get significant. And the worrying thing is it looks as if there's a doubling rate of something like 20 years or even less. And that's going to bring you to, the IPCC talk about a 1 metre rise by the end of the century, but a lot of climate scientists think it's going to be significantly more than that, and it could quite easily be 2 metres. And just a reminder of what 2 metres would mean in the UK. In East Anglia, the sea would come way inland to Peterborough and Cambridge. Boston and Spalding towns would be in real trouble of inundation. So it gives you some idea of how a relatively small rise can play absolutely havoc in areas which are very low lying. Now, one of the other gases other than carbon dioxide that's a concern is methane, because over a short period, over about 20 years, it's much more powerful than carbon dioxide in terms of its ability to absorb heat, trap heat. In fact, it's something like 86 times more potent. So the last thing we want is lots more methane in the atmosphere. Getting on for 1.5 trillion tons is thought to be locked up underneath the submarine permafrost in the Arctic. You probably know that large areas of northern Canada, Siberia, etc., are frozen, permanently frozen, permafrost as it's known, but that extends under the seas, under the shallow seas as well. And so there's a lot of methane there waiting to come out. It's a little bit controversial still, but a number of scientists working in this area have suggested that you could see burps, as they put it, of up to 50 billion tons coming out in one go. It is debated at the moment, so that's not a certainty. But if that happened, it would increase the methane content of the atmosphere overnight, literally, almost overnight, literally, by 12 times. And that in turn would bring global heating forward by 30 years. So, if it happened this year, we'd be where we thought we'd be in something like the mid-2050s. Now, it is still controversial. One of the arguments is that a lot of methane will be absorbed by the seawaters as it's rising. Others have said that when you look back at times of rapid heating, you don't see this sort of thing happening, or what they say is there's no evidence of it. But obviously, the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, so the jury's still out. And in any case, there are increasing volumes of methane coming out of the permafrost right across both land and sea at high latitudes in the Northern Hemisphere. Now, this is what I mentioned earlier, the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which is a pattern of currents, current circulation in the North Atlantic. The Gulf Stream is part of this. You may know it's what keeps the UK and Northern Europe warmer than it otherwise would be, because we're pretty much on a level with Labrador in Canada, which is much, much colder. Now, the AMOC, to give it its much abbreviated form, which is a lot easier to say, is at its weakest for at least 1,500 years, quite possibly 11.5, which is the end of the last ice age. If you read IPCC reports, they talk of a possible weakening further weakening this century, but the collapse of the current is unlikely to happen before 2100. But this has all changed very recently. There have been a number of papers published. One last year talked about shutdown any time after 2025, with 2050 as a central estimate. Well, there's been another one. There's another one that is in peer review. It hasn't actually been published yet, which talks about collapse between the 2030s and 2065, with it being more likely than not that collapse will occur before 2050. So this is imminent, virtually. And as I mentioned earlier, it will have particular ramifications for the Atlantic region, especially Europe. You're looking at least a 3 degrees C temperature fall, but possibly up to 10 degrees C. A sudden, because the currents will all back up, you will also see a big sea level rise, maybe a meter sea level rise along the coast of North America, and then knock-on effects right across the planet in terms of the global weather systems. Now, climate scientists don't really know how bad this will be. There is one paper that was published some time ago which looked at what happened the last time the AMOC collapsed 10 or 11,000 years ago. And they looked at a lake in Ireland which showed evidence of freezing over a period of a couple of months. And it stayed frozen for more than 80 years. If you've seen the film The Day After Tomorrow, you think this is bonkers, and a lot of it is bonkers, obviously. But that is really quite scary. Everything I've talked about so far is really about the physical impacts, but the other thing about climate breakdown is that it's a threat multiplier. It makes things worse that we already live with. Obviously, it makes weather worse. Famine, food security, health, mental illness, war, civil unrest, all these things are impacted upon by climate breakdown, and not in a good way. Extreme weather, we're familiar with now because we see it every day on the television. Most notably, extreme rainfall, floods, heat waves, drought, wildfires. Attribution studies which have been undertaken which can actually pinpoint a particular weather event and say whether it's more likely, whether it's worse or whatever due to climate breakdown are now, these attributions are announced within days now of an event happening. So looking at 500 extreme weather events, a study in 2022 shows that just over 70% are made more likely or severe due to global heating. 12 events would have been virtually impossible. 1 in 3 summer heat deaths in the last 30 years are due to climate breakdown. That is in the millions. That's millions of deaths already. And the fingerprints of global heating can be found as far back as the 1930s Dust Bowl conditions in the United States. Food. Well, we know a lot of people on the planet go to bed hungry every night. In the 80s, there were around 15 food emergencies a year. Now there are more than 30. It's not just climate breakdown, obviously. Other factors like war and civil unrest play a part as well. Agricultural productivity is a fifth down since 1960 on what it would have been if climate breakdown hadn't happened. And this is probably the scariest prediction I've seen anywhere. By mid-century, the world will need 50% more food, but crop yields could be down 30%. Now that's sort of getting on for, on average, a halving of calories of everyone on the planet. You can see that that's going to lead to all sorts of nasty things happening. One of the aspects of a hotter world is not just the heat alone, it's a combination of heat and humidity. What are becoming more common are humid heat waves, where a combination of humidity and heat makes it impossible for human beings to sweat. heat and humidity are measured on a wet bulb thermometer. And once you get above 35 degrees on a wet bulb thermometer, then you have 6 hours to live, unless you can find air conditioning. Because the body can't get rid of heat, ultimately the organs start to fail and you die. It doesn't matter how young or fit you are, or whether you're in the shade or whatever, makes no difference. Now, these conditions are being found increasingly in parts of Australia, Mexico, Gulf, South Asia, etc., and they're becoming rapidly more common. So, they will continue to increase and last longer. And once they get beyond the 6 hour period, then that's when real problems start. And the most at-risk area is the very highly irrigated North China Plain, which is a huge agricultural region. 400 million people work in the fields there. Most of them have no access to air conditioning, and it's very humid because of the irrigation. So later in this century, you could see situations where millions of people will die in a single day as a result of this. Climate wars. Well, wars can be fought over all sorts of things in the future, and probably will. Food, water, land, as a consequence of mass migration, resources. Just to give one example here, as the sea ice fades away in the Arctic region, so the northwest and northeast passages open up to shipping, and also new areas open up to exploration for oil and gas. Mind-boggling, I know, when the planet's collapsing, but these people will still be out there because obviously money is so important. So you will get clashes between the nations surrounding the Arctic. Already they're trying to get their hands on various bits: Russia, Canada, United States, and even Japan and China are trying to get in on the act as well. So this is just one area where you could see issues arising in terms of resources and other aspects of climate change, climate breakdown. But I think the area of most concern in terms of conflict is got to be Southeast Asia, because nearly every major river in this part of the world is sourced in the Himalayas and Tibetan Plateau. Now, with a business as usual scenario, 2/3 of the glaciers will be gone by the end of the century. Even if you manage to stay below 1.5, you're still looking at 1/3 of them going. And those rivers, the Indus, Ganges, Mekong, Yellow, Yangtze, etc., they provide the water that provides the irrigation that allows 2 billion people to grow crops and to grow food for themselves. By mid-century, it's expected that the problem will be too much water, because obviously the ice will be melting rapidly, so you'll start to get deluges, flash floods down the rivers. But after that, the rivers will start to fail, so that from the 2060s, there will be less and less water available from them. And also power losses. Many of these rivers have loads of dams on them, which provide power. The levels will drop, so power becomes much more difficult to generate. And competition for water and energy will increase dramatically between especially China, India and Pakistan, where there are already the three countries going at each other a little bit about water resources. And remember, all three of these countries have nuclear weapons. Doesn't get any better, really. Societal breakdown. I'll mention who this guy is in a minute, if you haven't heard of him. Accelerating climate breakdown will translate into massive and persistent social and economic shocks. There's no doubt about this. Extreme weather is already significantly impacting crops. Already chocolate, coffee, wine are all suffering. Can you imagine a world without coffee, chocolate or wine? It doesn't bear thinking about, does it really? In the UK, our main cereal crops this year are down 13% because of the very wet conditions last year, and it doesn't really look as if they're going to get any better this year. And these sorts of shocks are happening all over the planet. Extreme weather losses are expected to cost $38 trillion a year by 2050. That's getting on for a third of global domestic product. The UN has said relatively recently 345 people are marching towards starvation, 345 million people. And the Human Development Index, which has always been going up since it was put together, is supposedly marks progress. Whatever it does, it's heading down now in 90% of countries. And you're seeing, for example, even in developed countries, life expectancy dropping. These are all trends which you would expect to continue as things deteriorate further. And then the reason I've shown a picture of this chap is because he's famous for saying there are only 9 meals between mankind and anarchy. Once it becomes difficult to get food, imagine that you can't get food for 2 days. You're in the UK. Rationing has been introduced. It's stopped working. There's not enough to go around. You don't go to work. You try and find food. So very quickly, factories close down. Things begin to fall apart. And it doesn't take very long. And if you have 3 days without food, then it doesn't take a great imagination to see how things can become anarchic very quickly. 3 meals is bad enough for me, to be honest, if not less. Now, you wouldn't believe what's going on to see what politicians are doing around the world. Effectively nothing. We need to be on a war footing if we're going to stop dangerous climate breakdown translating into a climate cataclysm. And there are paper after paper coming out in the last year or two predicting severe drops in global domestic product around the world as a result of climate breakdown. There's just a few examples here. US National Bureau of Economic Research for a 3°C rise, which we're pretty much on track for. More than a 50% fall in output, capital consumption by the end of the century. A Nature study quite recently, average income's down by almost a fifth in the next just 25 years or so, compared to without climate breakdown. For a business as usual scenario, 60% down by the end of the century. So we have a government now which is demanding more and more growth, but all the serious studies are saying that's not going to happen. Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, this is a particularly astounding prediction because actuaries are not regarded as the most, how can I put it? Then they don't go in for hyperbole, if you like. I think, aren't actuaries described as failed accountants or something like that? I can't remember. But anyway, their recent report talks of destruction of 50% destruction of GDP by 2070 to 2090. So you can see where all these trends are going. But you wouldn't think so from looking at, listening to the world leaders at the moment. You may know of a study which took place in the 1970s, which modelled and projected our future of society and economy on the planet, called Limits to Growth. Well, there have been 2 updates in the last couple of years, both of which say, well, it's still pretty much on track for what it said in the 1970s. One of these predicts societal collapse beginning as soon as 2040 for a business as usual scenario. So if people think it's their kids or their grandkids that are going to suffer, this is 15 years away. So it's not, the prospects are grim. This is a bit of a complicated graphic, just to try and show you what it's all about. Cold is blue, hot is red. Time is coming towards you. Glaciation over here, interglacials here. The Earth was here when this interglacial we're in at the moment started. And over time, it should have just followed a track coming along here. But what's happened instead, because of 2.55 trillion tons of carbon dioxide, is that we've now followed this path here. And we're about there. We need to get back up to here again. Or we just go down here. And heating accelerates and things get worse and worse. So that's the choice we have at the moment. There was a study undertaken some time ago now, which is very well established, about what would happen if we burnt all fossil fuel reserves that we know of on the planet. How much would the global average temperature rise above pre-industrial times go up? And the answer is 16 degrees. Now, at the moment, our planet is about 16 degrees, the average temperature. This would take the average to 30, 32. That's day, night, winter, summer, poles, equator, etc. That would make most of the planet uninhabitable for human beings and probably most other life as well. So this is, if we don't put a stop to what's happening, the 36 billion tons of carbon dioxide being pumped out by fossil fuel burning every year, this is what we'll end up with. And make no mistake, if we let fossil fuel corporations get away with it, they will burn the whole bloody lot. They have no intention of stopping. They're expanding operations now. They're cutting back on their green targets. They're almost giving them up altogether. So if we don't stop them, this will happen. And on that slightly more depressing note, I will stop. Apart from this quote, William Wilberforce, obviously he was talking about the slave trade, but it's very applicable. If this is the first time you've seen something like this, you may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you did not know. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions for our speaker? Otherwise, I can start with our first one. I don't know where I'm going to stand. This is the one you don't want to be asked, but I'm going to have to ask it. What can we do? What would you encourage us to do?
That is a hell of a question, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, right.
We personally, we can all do bits and pieces, but that is not the issue. The fossil fuel corporations try and make out that this is a demand side issue. It's all our fault for consuming stuff. It's not their fault. They're just, sucking out the oil because we want them to. But that's not the way to do it. They have to be stopped. And the best way of doing that is to stop all state subsidies, which total $7 trillion a year, to stop banks and any other financial institutions lending to them, and to stop insurance of fossil fuel facilities. If you do those three things, you make an enormous difference. If you just stopped subsidies, that would cut emissions by a third at a stroke. But governments and fossil fuel corporations are so entwined. I mean, their tentacles are everywhere. And somebody has to take a stand and say, well, we're not, in a country, in a government, and say, we're not doing this anymore. But that is it. When you look at 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide emitted a year and 36 billion from fossil fuel burning, that's where the key point is. That's what we have to do.
Thanks. Does anyone have any questions? Otherwise, I do have another one because I love it. You have one? Oh, no. Okay.
Again?
Yeah, it's me again. But this is great. You showed us a couple of different scenarios that you think are going to happen. You were talking about how sea level rise in one scenario, I think you were talking about, might go up to the Lake District where you're currently living.
Peak District.
The Peak District, sorry. Peak District where I think you're living. So that's kind of, it's interesting whether or not we need to start thinking about populations at higher altitudes. I'm curious whether or not what you think is going to happen to cities in those kind of contexts. Do we need to start, are we going to be able to save cities? Are we going to be mining those cities? Are we going to have floating cities?
We're not going to have any cities.
You think there's going to be a general move away from city living?
Yeah, I think. One of the things that's going to happen soonest is that in summer, the combination of temperature and humidity are going to be so bad that people will move out of cities, because cities are a number of degrees hotter because of the heat island effect. And if you take Britain, for example, our housing stock is terrible. The insulation is awful, and that means heat can get in as well as heat getting out in the winter. we're doing next to nothing about making cities resilient. In other words, they need to have porous surfaces so you don't get flash flooding. They need to be green like anything. The roofs need to have reflective panels or white paint or whatever to keep the temperature down. All these things need doing, but they're not happening anywhere. So before these things actually get put in place, people are going to be moving out of cities further north and uphill. And that's going to be happening pretty much everywhere, including the UK.
Thanks. You got one? Sure.
Thank you for probably the most gloomy warning that we will hear this week. Nonetheless, I think most scientists would agree with the diagnosis. They might argue about the timescale. And I don't think any serious scientist is ever going to say these things are not going to happen, but there may be small amounts of mitigation that will be beneficial for the timescale. I think the task for architects and engineers, environmental engineers dealing with this, is it possible to, in your view, to design new ways of living that are going to cope, let's say, with 3.5 to 4.5 degrees?
Those sorts of temperature rises, a prediction for the population of the Earth in 2100 is the equivalent to 1900. So, a lot of people will have died by then. The thing is, as things fall apart and we don't do anything, there is then not the money to take adaptive measures and mitigation measures. So, designing new cities and doing all these sorts of things, if we leave it too late, there won't be the money or the infrastructure to do that. That's the real concern. If people haven't got enough food in 20 years' time, they're not going to care about a new project to do this, that, or the other. And it's an issue with, particularly with things like coastal flooding, inundation by the sea. I mean, a number of people say to me, well, by 2050, we'll have the technology to build great big walls. Well, no, we won't. We won't have the money to do it either. So I don't know how things are going to develop. I suspect most people will be living in tents.
Yeah. Well, like they would have moved up into the highest elevation they can find.
Well, yes, yeah.
Growing most of their own food.
Well, I have an acre. I grow as much as possible, and I'm now increasing water harvesting capacity, collecting seed, and this sort of thing, because I don't see actions happening quickly enough to get on top of things, really. So yeah.
But part of my role, I think, is to encourage young architects to think about these things and think, how is it possible to live in that world, and to know more about not so much the global average, but about the specifics of where they actually live or in which countries they are. And some inevitably will be uninhabitable. I think you mentioned 1900, and if memory serves, world population in 1900 was 1.5 billion, somewhere
like
around
that.
there.
Yeah.
Shockingly, in my lifespan, the year I was born, it was about 2.25 million, and is now 8 billion, and is now 8 billion. So what happens in one lifespan can be astonishing amount of change.
Well, it can if we're carrying out an experiment that's never happened in 4.6 billion years. I mean, speaking of buildings and design and architecture, whatever, though, if I was starting a company now, I would make and sell external shutters. Because they have those in France and Spain, places like that. They have them for a reason, for keeping out the heat. We've got nothing like that in the UK. But
I think the UK's housing, I think your diagnosis is correct. So there are many places in the world where there are older technologies that can be reimagined. Where they have lived with drought and prolonged heat. We just need to move that, to the higher latitudes and with new technologies. So.
Well, my house was built in 1676, and it has walls that are 2/3 of a metre thick. And even when it was 38 degrees C there in 2022, it was still cold inside, which is tremendous.
Questions from anyone else?
Yes, I do apologise, but it's not pessimism, it's just reality. We have to face it.
Do you, you're clearly looking at a lot of this kind of stuff, and are there any good case studies or good examples that you can share of people or places or things that you think are doing something that can be copied?
Well, there are lots of, there are always little things happening. Particularly, it's not directly related to climate change, but there are lots of rewilding projects and this sort of thing, and new ways of agriculture, regenerative agriculture, all these sort of things. These are all, there are positive things happening, but in the grand scheme of things, they don't make a huge difference. So I'm always cheered up when I see some, that we, for example, have beavers in lots of places in the UK now. They've been introduced and they've escaped and they're all over the place and they're improving flood risk, which is what they do. So there are nice stories like that, but in the grand scheme of things, they are so tiny. As long as 36 billion tons of carbon dioxide has been pumped out every year, then it just overwhelms everything.
In one of I think it's the most recent IPCC report, it also points at particular industries that it thinks are having the largest contribution to global warming, and also compares them to the Sustainable Development Goals. I was wondering whether or not what you think in response. Are there particular industries that you think are that need to be focused on more? And I was kind of curious where you might think that architecture in the built environment is in that kind of scale.
I don't think it matters about different industries. It doesn't matter who's using the most fossil fuels. Once fossil fuels get out of the ground and into the general economy, you can't do much about it. If you're going to stop fossil fuels having the impact they're having, you have to stop them at the boreholes. That's where you have to do it. Once they get out into industry, and all different industries are using carbon dioxide for this, that, and the other, then it's incredibly difficult. You have to work to. You have to have policies to get all those industries to reduce their emissions. Whereas if you stop the oil coming out, you make it impossible for fossil fuel companies to make a profit. So they go into green technologies, for example. Then you're there, really. Everybody knows that's what needs to be done, but they refuse to. I wouldn't say they were in the fossil fuel companies' pockets, but it's not far off that. But that's what has to happen. That is the easiest way of doing it. Leave fossil fuels in the ground. And when people say, oh, but how are we going to cope? That's the wrong way to look at it. What you need to say is, we have to keep fossil fuels in the ground, and then we have to work out how we're going to cope. You can't do it the other way around, otherwise it will never end.
And I was curious where you see carbon regulations and carbon accounting and actually putting a cost value to these things within that kind of suite of tools that we should be using to do this? Or is that just not far enough, quick enough?
No, I don't think that's not going to work. When you monetize stuff, it doesn't, capitalism is about monetizing everything. It's not going to work. They need to be stopped. Government subsidies in particular need to stop. And if you can reduce emissions by a third, that would be transformative. And all that needs to happen is that governments need to stop subsidising fossil fuel corporations. It's not hard. And they would actually have more money, for God's sake.
Are there any questions from anyone else?
You're working hard at thinking up all these questions. I
know, I've had them saved up. It's fine. It's not a problem for me.
Hi.
Hi.
I have short questions. When you say it will happen, never, don't you think it's a bit nihilistic way to see things?
Well, all those figures are from peer-reviewed papers. They're not me saying them. I'm just quoting stuff from academic papers, the numbers and figures. This isn't just my personal perspective. I'm taking this research that's published every week at the moment and putting that information up there. So you add all that up and it is nihilistic. Yeah, it is. we are in a desperate situation. We have never, ever in the whole history of our planet experienced these sorts of conditions. Never. And that is a fact. It would be lovely if I was wrong. I wish I was wrong. I wish all the other 10,000 climate scientists were wrong. But
I just wish I could see a bit more lighter ways to hear or.
Well, I wish so.
solutions.
I wish it as well. But there's nothing to be gained by pretending things are better than they are. And things are grim. They are really, really grim at the moment. And that's just the way it is. I would love to be more optimistic, but that would not be the truth.
Okay, thank you.
You're okay with that? Yeah. You're going to be one of the ones who have to think about how we live in a changed world. Where's your home country?
Thailand.
Thailand, yeah. So if you became an expert on what's expected in Thailand in 25 years' time, 50 years' time.
Better start building those sea defences, I think.
Yeah. Then you'd be able to maybe talk to people about these are the kinds of things you should be doing, these are the kind of designs you should be making. But some parts of the Earth, almost all scientists agree, will become uninhabitable. They just argue about the timescale.
I don't think there's much argument about timescale, to be honest.
Okay, so maybe we'll adjourn to the bar. There are drinks for everyone.
That's the best idea, best thing I've heard all night.
Continue the conversation.